Welcome back to the Core EM Podcast. Core content for anyone, anywhere, and just in time. This is the official podcast of the NYU Bellevue EM Residency Program. I'm Anand Swaminathan.
And I'm Jenny Beck-Esme.
All right, so Jenny, what do we got on tap for today?
We had a great talk this week from one of our senior faculty members, Bob Rothberg, on Lisfranc injuries. So I thought we could talk a bit about that. Before we start, though, Swami, do you know the history of the Lisfranc fracture?
Oh, do I know it? I love this story. This is one of my favorite stories in all of medicine, but
Okay.
I'm gonna let you tell it.
Let me tell it. So Lisfranc was Napoleon's field surgeon, and he noticed that soldiers on horseback who fell from their horses while their feet were in the stirrups sustained this horrible midfoot injury. Now, Napoleon wasn't a super understanding guy, and he obviously wanted his soldiers back on the battlefield. Now, unfortunately, these injuries healed really poorly and led to some significant disabilities. So Lisfranc came up with the solution: a midfoot amputation. Sure, it was a major surgery, but those who survived were back out there for the army. It's crazy.
It totally makes sense. I mean, instead of having a broken foot that heals poorly, just chop it off.
Just chop it off. No big deal.
There wasn't a lot of anesthesia back then, so I'm just hoping that they got him good and drunk before they did this.
I hope so.
Yeah, I hope so too. Now, I don't know a lot about Napoleon. In fact, all of the information I know about Napoleon comes from Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure.
That's a great history lesson.
It's a great history lesson. I think it's completely accurate as well. So Napoleon was short, had his hand in his coat, and he really liked water parks. That's what I know about him.
I'm sure that is all 100% true.
I think so. I think it absolutely is. All right, so let's get back to the Lisfranc injury. Let's define the injury first. So it's an injury to the midfoot resulting in displacement of one or more of the metatarsal bones from the tarsus. Basically, it's a tarso-metatarsal disruption. The classic injury occurs under high velocity and involves fracture along with dislocation. However, there's also a low velocity subtype where there's displacement but no fracture.
So obviously, as with anything orthopedic, this is very visual. So we'll have some images up on the show notes for you to refer to. The classic injury typically occurs with falls from height or a direct injury to the midfoot, while the non-classic variety can occur with a simple twisting of the foot or a fall over a flexed foot.
So when a patient comes in with these injuries, they're typically going to have a significant amount of swelling and ecchymosis. They're going to have significant pain, of course, and it's unlikely they'll be able to put any weight on the foot at all. If the patient isn't in too much pain, you can do some physical examination tests to find the fracture. The most common of these is the squeeze test, squeezing the midfoot to see if it elicits pain. But, Jenny, most of the patients that I've seen with this are in a ton of pain, and squeezing it just seems to be mean.
Yeah, patients love it when you squeeze the part of them that hurts.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So I think we're going to start here with getting x-rays of the foot, AP, lateral, and oblique, after you provide the patient with some analgesia, of course. The common fracture you see is one of the proximal second metatarsal, along with displacement of the metatarsals in relation to the cuneiform bones. Again, you can have displacement without the fracture. On the AP, you want to look at the base of the metatarsals and specifically the relation of the first and second metatarsals. If the space between these is even 1 millimeter larger than normal, you've got a Lisfranc injury.
Since this isn't always obvious, obtaining contralateral x-rays for comparison can be really helpful in case you have sort of an equivocal x-ray you're not quite sure.
So if the contralateral x-rays are similar, then you're done?
Well, not quite. If the contralateral x-ray doesn't reveal anything, try walking the patient. If they can't walk, you can move on to weight-bearing x-rays, which will exaggerate any displacement between the first and second metatarsals. If the patient can't stand to do that weight-bearing film, a CT will show the relationship between all of these structures, as well as any occult fracture very clearly.
Once you've found the Lisfranc injury, your work has just begun. Most of these will require operative management, so it's reasonable to get your orthopedic surgeon on board at this point. If the patient had a high velocity injury, you also have to be suspicious for compartment syndrome. Again, your exam here is going to be limited since any movement of the foot is going to cause significant pain. So you or your orthopedic team may need to shoot a compartment pressure.
Yeah, we've covered compartment syndrome in the blog in the past, so we'll drop a link to that in the show notes. If you're not worried about compartment syndrome and the patient's pain is well controlled, you want to put the patient in a posterior splint, strict non-weight bearing, and they should have follow-up with an orthopedic surgeon in the next week or so, since as you mentioned, they're likely going to need operative repair. But of course, this isn't going to just be a transmetatarsal amp. We have progressed a little bit since the time of Napoleon, and we have some real surgeries to try and repair these now. All right, Jenny, so that was a pretty quick podcast, but let's hit our listeners with some take-home points.
Absolutely. So first, a Lisfranc injury is a midfoot injury that results in displacement of one or more of the metatarsal bones from the tarsus. Second, an X-ray is going to show you widening of the space between the first and second metatarsals. Getting contralateral X-rays may help you to identify this. Third, even if you don't see that widening on the X-ray, the patient could still have a Lisfranc injury. If they can't walk due to their pain, try and get a weight-bearing X-ray or a CT scan to look further. And then last, once the injury is identified, the patient must be strict non-weight-bearing. Place them in a posterior splint and get orthopedics involved either in the ED or for prompt follow-up, as the patient is probably going to need a surgery.
Well, that's all for the Core EM podcast this week. Come on over and check out the site at coreem.net. We've got a ton of great core content emergency medicine. We'll have a core post up on Wednesday and a journal update up on Thursday. Don't forget to check out our Facebook page, follow us on Google Plus and on Reddit, and of course on Twitter, where our handle is @core_EM. Thanks, and see you all next week.